The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and disappointment. I sat there, 38 years old, listening to a stranger read my parents' will while my brother Connor smirked from across the mahogany table. To our son, Connor James Whitfield, we leave the house in Bethesda, all financial accounts, the investment portfolio, both cars, and all personal belongings, the lawyer read in his monotone voice. To our daughter, Rosalind Marie Whitfield, we leave our collection of family photographs and her mother's sewing machine. Photos and a sewing machine. 23 years of being the perfect daughter, and I got photos and a broken singer from 1987. Connor didn't even try to hide his satisfaction. He leaned back in his Italian leather chair, probably bought with money he'd stolen from our parents over the years, and actually winked at me. Like this was a game he'd won. The lawyer continued reading, but I'd stopped listening after he got to the part explaining why. My parents had written a letter, attached to the will. 3 pages explaining how Connor deserved everything because he'd given them grandchildren, carried on the family name, and stayed close to home. While I, and here my mother's words stung even from beyond the grave, had chosen career over family, moved away for college, failed to provide grandchildren despite being the older one. Connor had 2 kids, sure. Kids he saw every other weekend because his ex-wife Melissa had full custody after she caught him embezzling from his own company. My parents had raised more than he had, buying their clothes, paying for their schools, babysitting every time Connor needed to disappear for another one of his schemes. But Connor was the son, and in the Whitfield family, that had always meant everything. I watched him sign the papers, his signature bold and careless. $3 million in assets, just like that. The house alone was worth $1.8 million. The investments are another $1 million at least. Plus Dad's pension, Mom's life insurance, their savings. Everything they'd spent 50 years building. The lawyer asked if I had any questions. I had plenty, but none he could answer. Like why I'd spent every weekend for 3 years driving from Philadelphia to Bethesda when Mom got cancer. Why I'd paid for Dad's home nurse when his dementia got bad, telling them Medicare covered it so they wouldn't feel guilty. Why I'd been the one sitting in hospital waiting rooms, arguing with doctors, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, while Connor was always too busy to visit. No questions, I said, my voice steady. 20 years as a federal prosecutor had taught me to never show emotion when it mattered. Connor stood up, straightening his coat. The Rolex on his wrist caught the light, Dad's watch, obviously taken before the will was even read. He walked over to me, put his hand on my shoulder in fake sympathy. I have something for you in the car, he said. Mom wanted you to have it. I followed him out to the parking lot to his new BMW, also probably bought with money that wasn't his. He opened the trunk and pulled out a cardboard box. Inside were photo albums, loose pictures, and Mom's old sewing machine, the one that hadn't worked since 1993. She always said you were sentimental, he said, not even trying to hide his mockery. Thought you'd want these. The house is going on the market next week, so if there's anything else you want, better come get it. I'll be changing the locks tomorrow. That house. The house where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway. Where I'd nursed Mom through chemo in the guest room I'd converted to a sick room. Where Dad had forgotten my name but still smiled when I walked in. My childhood home, being sold to fund Connor's next failed business venture. Connor loaded the box into my 12-year-old Honda, the car I'd never upgraded because I was too busy paying for Mom's treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. He patted the roof like he was sending me off. Hey, Rosie, he said, using the nickname I'd hated since we were kids. Mom and Dad made their choice. Maybe if you'd given them what they wanted, a nice son-in-law, some grandkids, a normal life instead of chasing criminals in Philly, maybe things would be different. But you chose your path. And they chose me. He walked back to his BMW, got in, drove away. Left me standing in that parking lot with a box of photos and a broken sewing machine, my entire inheritance. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at those photo albums. Pictures of me at every age. First day of school. Graduation from law school. Connor hadn't attended. My swearing in as an assistant U.S. attorney, Connor had been in rehab that week. Every birthday, every Christmas, every achievement. all documented by the parents who decided I deserved nothing. But between those photos, I saw something else. Documents tucked between pages. Bank statements. Wire transfers. Loan applications. My mother, even in her final act of betrayal, had been meticulous about record keeping. And she'd hidden it all in the one thing she knew Connor would never touch: family photos. I pulled out a bank statement from 2018, a $50,000 withdrawal from my parents' savings. Connor's signature at the bottom. Then another from 2019, and 2020, and 2021. Hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred out of my parents' accounts over the years. All with Connor's signature, but I knew my parents' handwriting. These signatures were forgeries. My brother hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He'd been stealing from our parents for years, and they'd been too proud or too sick to stop him. Or maybe they hadn't even known. Dad's dementia had started earlier than we'd realized. Mom had been fighting cancer, trusting Connor to handle their finances. I looked at that box of photos again. My mother's final gift wasn't sentimental. It was evidence. Connor thought he'd won. Thought he'd gotten away with the greatest theft of his life. But he'd forgotten what I did for a living. I prosecuted financial crimes. I'd sent executives to federal prison for less than what he'd done. And now he'd made the fatal mistake of putting it all in writing, notarized, legal. My name is Rosalind Whitfield, and I spent my entire childhood trying to be enough for parents who were waiting for their real child to succeed. Connor came 3 years after me, and from the moment he was born, the dynamics shifted. I became the responsible one, the one who had to set an example. Connor became the golden child who could do no wrong. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, in a colonial house my parents bought in 1978 for $30,000. That house became their entire identity, proof they'd made it, that they were successful, that the Whitfield name meant something. Every Sunday, my mother would host dinner for her church friends, showing off her home like it was Versailles. My father would trim the hedges with military precision, making sure the neighborhood knew the Whitfields maintained standards. By the time I was in high school, I knew my role. Straight A's, National Honor Society, debate team captain. I got into Georgetown on a full scholarship, the first Whitfield to attend an elite university. My parents framed my acceptance letter, showed it to everyone. For about 6 months, I was their pride. Then Connor got arrested for the first time. He was 15, caught stealing from the electronics store at the mall. My parents hired a lawyer, got the charges dropped, and never spoke of it again. When I asked why Connor didn't face consequences, my mother said boys will be boys, and besides, he was going through a tough time. The tough time was me leaving for college, apparently. My success was traumatizing my brother. I went to law school at Penn, graduated magna cum laude. Got recruited by the Department of Justice straight out of school. Started as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, prosecuting white-collar crime. By 30, I was lead prosecutor on major cases, sending corrupt politicians and fraudulent CEOs to federal prison. Meanwhile, Connor bounced between failures. Dropped out of community college twice. Started 5 different businesses with money my parents gave him, lost it all each time. Got married to Melissa at 25, had 2 kids by 28, divorced by 30 when she caught him stealing from his own company's payroll. But Connor stayed in Bethesda. Lived 10 minutes from my parents, showed up for Sunday dinners, brought the grandkids even during his limited custody. That proximity meant everything to them. I was in Philadelphia, only 2 hours away, but might as well have been on Mars. My apartment in Rittenhouse Square was small but mine. 1 bedroom, a kitchen I actually used, an office where I prepared cases that made headlines. I had a life there, friends from work, a book club, a favorite coffee shop where they knew my order. I dated occasionally, but nothing serious. The men I met either felt threatened by my job or fetishized it. Neither worked for me. When Mom got diagnosed with lung cancer, never smoked a day in her life. I rearranged everything. I worked remotely when I could, drove down every weekend, sometimes twice a week. Connor showed up for the diagnosis appointment and disappeared for the treatment. Too hard to see Mom like that, he said. My parents understood. Connor was sensitive. Dad's dementia started slowly. forgetting names, repeating stories. Then it accelerated. By the time Mom was in remission, Dad couldn't remember what year it was. I hired a home health aide, paid for it myself, told them Medicare covered it. Connor promised to check on them daily since he lived so close. Later I learned he'd been visiting all right to access their bank accounts. The federal courthouse in Philadelphia became my second home. I had a reputation there, the prosecutor who never lost, who could find financial crimes others missed. I'd sent dozens of men like Connor to prison. Men who thought family connections or charm or proximity to power protected them. Men who forgot that numbers don't lie, even when everyone else does. If you're watching this, maybe you know what it's like to be the responsible child who gets nothing. The one who sacrifices while the family fails gets rewarded. Subscribe if this resonates. And let me know where you're watching from. Sometimes it helps to know you're not alone in this. The signs were there for years, but I'd been trained since birth not to see them. Every Christmas, Connor would have a new sob story. His business partner screwed him over. The market turned at the wrong time. His ex-wife was bleeding him dry. And every Christmas, my parents would write him another check. Meanwhile, I was carefully budgeting my federal prosecutor's salary, which sounds impressive until you realize it's less than first-year associates make at private firms. I drove the same Honda for 12 years, lived in the same one-bedroom apartment, shopped sales at Target. But I was stable, self-sufficient. That apparently made me not need help. The inequality became obvious at Dad's 75th birthday party. I'd organized everything, catered dinner, invited his old colleagues, created a photo slideshow that took weeks to compile. Connor showed up an hour late, drunk, with a gas station card. My parents lit up when he walked in. Dad actually pushed me aside to embrace Connor, saying how wonderful it was that his son made time for him. That night, Connor cornered me in the kitchen. "Must be nice," he said, "being the perfect daughter. Making the rest of us look bad with your fancy job and your perfect life." I was washing dishes, the caterers I'd paid for having left. "Perfect?" I repeated. "Connor, I work 70-hour weeks prosecuting criminals. I spend weekends driving here to help Mom and Dad. I haven't taken a vacation in 3 years." He laughed, this bitter sound that reminded me of when we were kids and he'd broken my toys out of spite. "At least you have a career. You know what I have? Expectations. Everyone was waiting for me to be the man Dad was, to provide like he did. You got to escape. I'm stuck here. Stuck. In the $1 million house my parents let him live rent-free after his divorce. With the car they'd bought him. Living off the money they kept giving him. But in Connor's mind, he was the victim. The real problem started when Mom got sick. I took family medical leave, used all my vacation days, spent $30,000 of my savings on treatments insurance wouldn't cover. Connor visited once a month, usually when he needed money. He'd sit with Mom for 15 minutes, then corner Dad about some investment opportunity. Dad, his mind already slipping, would agree to anything Connor asked. I tried to get power of attorney, but my parents refused. Connor was perfectly capable of helping with finances, they said. He understood business in a way I didn't. After all, I just worked for the government. I started noticing discrepancies in their accounts. Large withdrawals that didn't match their spending. When I asked Mom about it, she got defensive. Connor was helping them invest, she said. Making sure their money grew. I asked to see the investment statements. She said that was Connor's department. 6 months before they died, I found Connor in Dad's office, logged into their online banking. He jumped when I walked in, quickly closing the laptop. "Just helping Dad pay some bills," he said. "You know how confused he gets." I knew exactly how confused Dad got, which is why Connor shouldn't have been anywhere near their finances. But when I told Mom, she accused me of being jealous. Said I couldn't stand that Connor was finally succeeding at something. That I always had to be the special one. The last real conversation I had with my mother was an argument about Connor. I'd found out he'd taken out a home equity loan against their house, forged their signatures. I had the documents, the proof. Showed it all to her. She looked at the papers, then at me. Her face was thin from chemo, but her disappointment was still sharp. Connor's had a hard life, Rosalind. His business failed, Melissa took everything, he barely sees his kids. He needed help. He committed fraud, Mom. This is a crime. She waved her hand, dismissive even while dying. Family doesn't prosecute family. That's your problem, Rosalind. You see everything as a case. Connor's your brother, not one of your criminals. He is a criminal, I said. She turned away from me then, facing the wall of her sick room. The room I'd set up in the house I was paying to maintain with the equipment I'd bought. When you have children, she said, you'll understand. Sons need more help than daughters. They're not as strong as we are. That was 3 weeks before she died. She never spoke to me again, not really. Polite words, surface conversation, but nothing real. Connor was there when she passed, holding her hand. I was in the hospital cafeteria, getting coffee for everyone. He made sure to tell everyone at the funeral how Mom's last words were about how much she loved him. Dad died 6 months later. The dementia had progressed to where he didn't recognize anyone, but Connor told everyone Dad had a moment of clarity at the end, saying Connor was the son he'd always wanted. I was in court when it happened, prosecuting a man who'd defrauded elderly people out of their life savings. The irony wasn't lost on me. The will reading was scheduled for 2 weeks after Dad's funeral. I'd spent those weeks handling everything: estate taxes, funeral arrangements, cleaning out the house. Connor was too grief-stricken to help, apparently. So grief-stricken he'd already listed Dad's Rolex on eBay before the body was cold. Peterson and Associates was the law firm my parents had used for 40 years. Old Mr. Peterson had handled their first house purchase. His son, Gregory Peterson Jr., was handling the estate. I knew Gregory from law school, bottom of the class, passed the bar on his 3rd try, only had a practice because of nepotism. The perfect lawyer for Connor's purposes. I arrived early, a habit from years of court appearances. The receptionist, barely out of college, looked at me with pity. Everyone knew why I was there. Small law firm, smaller town gossip. The daughter who was about to get nothing. Connor arrived 15 minutes late, making an entrance. He'd dressed for the occasion, new suit, fresh haircut, even had his shoes shined. He looked like what he'd always wanted to be, successful. Like a man about to come into money. His girlfriend was with him. Ashley or Amber or something with an A, 25 at most, wearing a designer dress that cost more than I made in a month. She looked at me like I was furniture, something to navigate around. Connor had probably already told her about the inheritance, promised her shopping sprees and vacations. Gregory cleared his throat, began reading. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. Everything to Connor. The house, the money, the investments, even Mom's jewelry. To me, photos and a sewing machine that hadn't worked since Clinton was president. But then Gregory read the letter. The justification. 3 pages of my parents explaining why Connor deserved everything. He'd provided grandchildren. He'd stayed close. He'd carried on the family name. He'd suffered enough with his divorce and business failures. He needed help. And me? I'd chosen career over family. Moved away. Failed to marry. Failed to reproduce. I was successful enough on my own and didn't need their help. Besides, as a woman, I'd probably just marry someone wealthy eventually. Connor, as a man, needed to be able to provide. The words were Mom's, but the sentiment was both of them. Every stereotype, every outdated notion, every disappointment compiled into a legal document. The final judgment on my life from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Connor was watching me as Gregory read, waiting for me to break. To cry or scream or beg. That's what he'd always fed on, my emotional reactions, proof that the perfect daughter could crack. But I'd learned to hide reactions in court, facing murderers and sociopaths. Connor was amateur hour compared to them. When Gregory finished, he asked if I had questions about the will's execution. I asked only one. When was this signed? January 15th of this year, Gregory replied. 6 weeks after Mom died. When Dad couldn't remember his own name, let alone make legal decisions. I looked at the signature page Gregory showed me. Dad's signature was perfect. Too perfect. The exact same signature from documents 20 years ago, before Parkinson's made his hands shake. Any other questions? Gregory asked, already closing the folder. No, I said. Everything's perfectly clear. Connor stood up, straightened his jacket. Actually, Gregory, there's one more thing. My client would like to formally evict Ms. Whitfield from the Bethesda property. She's been staying there without permission. I'd been staying there cleaning out their belongings, preparing the house for sale, handling what Connor wouldn't. But legally, he was right. The house was his now. You have 72 hours to remove your belongings, Gregory said, not meeting my eyes. After that, anything left will be considered abandoned property. Connor walked me to the parking lot, performed his little show with the box of photos. His girlfriend waited in his BMW, already on her phone, probably looking at real estate listings in better neighborhoods. Connor loaded the box into my Honda, patted the roof of my car with condescension that dripped like syrup. Then he said the thing that sealed his fate. You know, Rosie, I almost feel bad for you. All those years trying to be daddy's little girl, and in the end, they saw you for what you are. Just another bitter career woman who'll die alone with her case files. At least the criminals you prosecute pretend to respect you. Mom and Dad didn't even pretend. He walked back to his BMW, got in, kissed his girlfriend for my benefit. They drove off laughing, leaving me in that parking lot with my inheritance of garbage and grief. But Connor had made a mistake. Several, actually. The forged will was just the beginning. The real mistake was not knowing what I'd find in those photos. The other mistake was forgetting that I had friends in the Department of Justice, the IRS, the FBI. The biggest mistake was thinking that because Mom and Dad were gone, no one would come after him for what he'd done. I sat in my car, going through those photos methodically. Mom had been many things: traditional, unfair, biased toward Connor, but she'd also been thorough. Every receipt, every bank statement, every forged check. All documented, all hidden between family photos. Like she knew someday someone would need this evidence. Maybe she meant for me to find it. Maybe it was her way of apologizing without admitting Connor was a criminal. Or maybe she just couldn't help herself, the bookkeeper's daughter who kept records of everything. Either way, she'd given me exactly what I needed. Connor thought he'd inherited $3 million. What he'd really inherited was a federal investigation that would destroy everything he'd built on lies. I drove back to Philadelphia with that box of photos in my trunk, my entire inheritance bouncing around every time I hit a pothole. My apartment felt smaller when I walked in, like the walls had absorbed my humiliation and reflected it back. I set the box on my kitchen table and stared at it for 3 days before I could bring myself to go through it properly. The first night, I drank a bottle of wine and cried. Not dignified tears, but ugly, body-shaking sobs that left me exhausted. 23 years of being a good daughter, and my reward was a broken sewing machine. Every sacrifice, every weekend spent driving to Bethesda, every dollar spent on their care, worthless. Less than worthless. Connor got millions for being a failure. I got nothing for being reliable. The second night, I called in sick to work and went through every photo, every memory. There I was at 6, missing front teeth, holding a trophy from the spelling bee. Connor hadn't competed. Too young, Mom had said, though other 5-year-olds had participated. There at 16, valedictorian speech in hand. Connor in the background, sulking because he'd been forced to attend. But between those photos, the real story emerged. Bank statements showing massive withdrawals. Forged checks with Connor's version of Dad's signature. Loan documents for money borrowed against the house, signed after Dad's diagnosis made him incompetent. Wire transfers to Connor's failed businesses, to his personal accounts, to his girlfriend's account. The most damning evidence was hidden behind my law school graduation photo. A full financial power of attorney document, giving Connor complete control over my parents' finances. Dated 2 years ago, when Dad couldn't remember what year it was and Mom was going through chemo. The signatures were laughably forged. Connor hadn't even tried to make them look authentic. By the third night, my grief had crystallized into something harder, sharper. I spread everything across my living room floor, organizing evidence like I was preparing for trial. Connor had stolen approximately $800,000 over 5 years. The will itself was fraudulent, signed by a man with advanced dementia. In any court, this would be elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and about 6 other felonies. But I needed more than just financial crimes. I needed to understand why my parents had let this happen. Why they'd chosen Connor even while he robbed them blind. I called my mother's sister, Aunt Helen, in Seattle. She'd stopped talking to my parents 5 years ago after a fight about Connor. Helen answered on the second ring, like she'd been expecting my call. "I heard about the will," she said without preamble. "I'm not surprised. Your parents were determined to see Connor as something he wasn't." "What do you mean?" I asked. Helen sighed. "Your mother called me 2 years ago crying. Said Connor had been stealing from them, but she couldn't prove it. Asked me what to do. I told her to call the police, get a lawyer, and protect themselves. You know what she said? She said Connor needed the money more than they did. That without their help, he'd have nothing." "She knew?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. "She knew everything, Rosie. Every forged check, every stolen dollar. Your father might have been too sick to understand, but your mother was sharp until the end. She let Connor steal because she couldn't face the truth, that her golden boy was a criminal. It was easier to pretend you didn't need help, that you were too successful to need inheritance. The truth hit harder than the will reading had. My parents hadn't just chosen Connor. They'd chosen their delusion about Connor over reality. They'd rather die believing their son was a good man who needed help than admit their daughter had been right all along." I hung up with Helen and sat in my dark living room, surrounded by evidence of Connor's crimes. I had 2 choices. I could let it go, accept the injustice, and move on with my life. Or I could do what I did best, build a case that would destroy him. The decision wasn't even a decision. Connor had stolen from sick, elderly parents. He'd forged documents, committed federal crimes, then had the audacity to take everything while telling me I deserved nothing. He'd made one fatal error, though. He'd done it to a federal prosecutor who specialized in exactly these kinds of crimes. I spent the rest of the night making lists. Every agency to contact, every form to file, every person to interview. Connor thought inheritance was his lottery ticket. He was about to learn it was actually an indictment. The plan formed like a prosecution strategy, methodical, comprehensive, designed to leave no escape route. Connor had committed federal crimes, but I couldn't just report them directly. As a family member and interested party, my accusations would look like sour grapes over inheritance. I needed outside verification, independent discovery of his crimes. First, I created a timeline. Every forged document, every stolen dollar, mapped against my parents' medical records. Dad's dementia diagnosis was dated 3 years before the will was signed. Mom's oncologist had documented her cognitive impairment from chemo 2 months before the power of attorney appeared. Legally, neither could consent to these documents. Next, I called Tom Hartley, a forensic accountant who'd been my expert witness in dozens of cases. Tom owed me. I'd gotten his son out of a wrongful arrest situation years ago. I hired him privately, paid cash, and asked him to analyze the financial documents as if he'd never met me. "This is massive fraud," Tom said after reviewing everything. "Your brother isn't just a thief, he's spectacularly bad at it. These forgeries wouldn't fool a first-year bank teller." "I need an independent report," I told him. "Something that could trigger an investigation without my involvement." Tom understood immediately. He'd file a suspicious activity report with the Treasury Department, standard procedure when encountering potential elder abuse. The report would go to multiple agencies, triggering mandatory investigations. While Tom worked on the financial side, I contacted Adult Protective Services retroactively, reported suspicions of elder abuse, documented my concerns about my parents' final years. The social worker, Margaret Daniels, took detailed notes. "Why didn't you report this earlier?" she asked. "My parents wouldn't let me," I said truthfully. "They were protecting my brother. I only discovered the extent after they died." Margaret had seen this before. Elderly parents enabling criminal children, too proud or scared to admit the truth. She opened a posthumous investigation, which would uncover the same evidence I'd found, but through official channels. The masterstroke came from an unexpected source. Melissa, Connor's ex-wife, called me after hearing about the will. She was furious that Connor had inherited millions while owing 2 years of child support. He tells the court he's broke, she said, but suddenly he has a new BMW? My kids are on reduced lunch programs while their father inherits millions? I suggested she might want to inform the court about Connor's change in circumstances. Maybe request a forensic accounting of his finances. Melissa was vindictive enough to do more than that. She hired the most aggressive family lawyer in Maryland, someone who'd subpoena every financial record Connor had ever touched. Connor, meanwhile, was living large. Posted photos on Instagram of his new boat, his golf club membership, vacation plans for Europe. He'd listed my parents' house for sale at $2 million, already spending money he didn't have yet. The girlfriend had moved in, redecorating with expensive furniture charged to my parents' credit cards that Connor hadn't canceled. 3 weeks after the will reading, the dominoes started falling. First, the Treasury Department opened an investigation based on Tom's report. They contacted Connor for financial records, which he couldn't provide because he'd destroyed most of them. Destroying financial documents under federal investigation is its own crime. Second, Adult Protective Services contacted the Maryland Attorney General's office about potential elder abuse. The AG's office opened a criminal investigation, subpoenaing medical records that proved my parents weren't competent to sign legal documents. Third, Melissa's lawyer filed for emergency asset freezing, arguing Connor was hiding money while avoiding child support. The court agreed, freezing all accounts Connor had inherited until a full accounting could be done. Connor called me, panicking. "What did you do?" He screamed into the phone. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said calmly. "I've been in Philadelphia, working." "Is something wrong?" "You know exactly what's wrong. You reported me. You're trying to steal my inheritance." "Your inheritance?" I asked. "Connor, you stole from Mom and Dad for years. Did you really think nobody would notice?" He hung up, but called back an hour later, this time pleading. "Rosie, we're family. You can't do this to your family. Call them off. Tell them it's a misunderstanding." "Like you misunderstood how to forge Dad's signature?" I asked. The silence stretched before he spoke again, his voice different. Cold. "You were always jealous. Perfect Rosalind who could never accept that Mom and Dad loved me more. This is just revenge." "No, Connor. This is justice. Revenge comes later." The first setback came from an unexpected source, Gregory Peterson Jr., the family lawyer. He filed a motion claiming I was harassing Connor, interfering with lawful inheritance. He accused me of filing false reports, manipulating government agencies, and conducting a vendetta against my brother. The motion was garbage legally, but it played well in the court of public opinion. Connor gave an interview to the local paper, painting himself as a grieving son being persecuted by his bitter sister. He actually cried during the interview, talking about how our parents' death had torn the family apart, how I couldn't accept their final wishes. The story gained traction. Prosecutor sister targets brother over inheritance, made the Washington Post. My office started getting calls. My boss, District Attorney Patricia Wong, called me in for a meeting. "Rosalind, I understand this is personal," she said, "but you're making the office look vindictive. The optics are terrible. Federal prosecutor angry about inheritance, using her connections to harass a grieving family member." "I'm not using any connections," I said. "I haven't filed a single report myself. These investigations started independently." Patricia studied me, knowing I was technically telling the truth while orchestrating everything. "Step back from this," she warned. "Let the system work without your input." I agreed, publicly. Privately, I doubled down. The second setback was worse. Connor hired Richard Blackstone, the kind of defense attorney who specialized in making victims look like criminals. Blackstone had defended politicians, mob bosses, people who should have gone to prison for life, but walked free. He cost $5,000 just to retain money Connor suddenly had despite claiming poverty to his ex-wife. Blackstone's first move was brilliant. He filed for conservatorship over my parents' estate retroactively, claiming he'd been their caregiver and deserved compensation for years of support. He produced receipts for groceries, medical supplies, and gas for driving them to appointments. All purchased with my parents' own credit cards, but Blackstone made it look like Connor's sacrifice. He also produced witnesses. church friends who'd seen Connor at my parents' house regularly, neighbors who confirmed he visited daily. His children, coached to tears, talking about how Uncle Connor had taken care of Grandma and Grandpa when Aunt Rosalind was too busy with her important job. The narrative was shifting. Connor wasn't a thief. He was a devoted son who'd sacrificed everything to care for aging parents, while his career-obsessed sister ignored them. The fact that I'd paid for everything, arranged everything, spent every weekend driving down, invisible, unprovable, without receipts I'd never kept. Then Connor made a mistake. He got cocky. Blackstone had advised him to stay quiet, play the victim. But Connor couldn't resist. He showed up at my apartment building in Philadelphia, drunk, with 2 friends as backup. I started screaming in the lobby about how I was destroying his life, how I'd poisoned our parents against him, how I deserved nothing because I was a frigid bitch who'd die alone. The building had security cameras. The doorman called the police. Connor shoved the responding officer, got arrested for assault and public intoxication. Blackstone got him released, but the damage was done. The grieving son mask had slipped, revealing the violent drunk underneath. But Connor's biggest mistake was Ashley, or Amber, his girlfriend. She'd gotten comfortable with the money and started posting everything on social media. The shopping sprees, the restaurants, the jewelry. She tagged Connor in everything, creating a digital trail of spending that contradicted his poverty claims. Melissa's lawyer subpoenaed the girlfriend's credit card records, finding purchases made with cards in my parents' names, used after their deaths. That's not inheritance, that's credit card fraud. The girlfriend, facing charges, flipped immediately. Admitted Connor had given her the cards, told her to buy whatever she wanted. The investigations accelerated. The FBI joined after the credit card fraud crossed state lines. The IRS started auditing Connor's taxes, finding years of unreported income from his theft. Maryland's Attorney General announced a grand jury investigation into elder abuse. Connor tried to flee. Bought a one-way ticket to Costa Rica using Dad's credit card. Got arrested at the airport, charged with flight to avoid prosecution. Blackstone dropped him as a client. Even mob lawyers have standards about clients who run. From his jail cell, Connor called me one more time. "You win," he said. "You destroyed me. Happy now?" "I haven't won anything," I told him. "I lost my parents who loved you more than me despite everything. I lost my childhood home. I lost any chance of a normal family. You did all that, Connor. I'm just making sure you pay for it." The trial date was set for March 15th, 1 year after the will reading. Connor faced 27 federal charges and 18 state charges. The prosecution estimated he'd stolen $1.2 million over 7 years, committed identity theft, elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and tax evasion. Each charge carried years in prison. If convicted on all counts, Connor would die behind bars. I wasn't allowed near the prosecution team, but I didn't need to be. The evidence was overwhelming, and I'd made sure it reached the right people. The lead prosecutor, Michael Chin, no relation, was someone I'd worked with before. Thorough, methodical, ruthless with financial criminals. Connor's new lawyer, a public defender named Sarah Martinez, tried to plea bargain. Connor would admit to lesser charges, serve 5 years, make restitution. The prosecution laughed. They had him dead to rights on every charge. No deals. 2 weeks before trial, I got a call from Margaret Daniels at Adult Protective Services. She'd been investigating my parents' final years and found something interesting. Connor had taken out life insurance policies on both parents 2 years before they died. $500,000 each, himself as sole beneficiary. The policies were purchased when Dad couldn't remember his name and Mom was undergoing radiation. That's when I realized Connor hadn't just been stealing. He'd been waiting for them to die. Maybe even hoping for it. The man who'd played devoted son had been counting days until he could cash in on their deaths. I forwarded this information to Michael Chin through Margaret, keeping my hands technically clean. The prosecution added insurance fraud to the charges. Connor's potential sentence went from life to life without parole. The week before trial, Connor's kids came to see me. 16 and 14 now, old enough to understand what their father had done. Melissa had driven them down from Baltimore, waited in the car while they talked to me. Aunt Rosie, the older one, Nathan said. We know Dad did bad things. But he's still our father. Can you help him? I looked at these kids, innocent of their father's crimes, suffering for them anyway. Part of me wanted to help, to show mercy. But then I remembered Connor laughing when I asked him to consider what this would do to his children. He'd said they'd be fine, they had their mother. Your father stole from sick, elderly people who loved him, I told them gently. He committed serious crimes. I can't help him avoid consequences for that. But I can make sure you're okay. Your grandparents would want that. I set up trust funds for both kids using my own money. Not much, but enough for college if they were careful. It wasn't their fault their father was a criminal. Connor would probably steal it if he could, but I made sure he'd never have access. March 1st, 2 weeks before trial, the house in Bethesda finally sold. $2.1 million to a young couple from Silicon Valley. The money went into an escrow account, frozen by the court pending the trial's outcome. Connor couldn't touch a penny. That same day, I went back to Bethesda one last time. The new owners let me walk through the empty house, remembering. The kitchen where Mom taught me to cook. The study where Dad helped with homework. The garage where Connor and I had played as kids, before he learned to resent me for existing. In the basement, I found something the estate sale had missed. A box of Christmas ornaments, each one labeled with the year and who made it. There were Connor's childish attempts at angels, my precisely crafted stars. Years of family holidays compressed into tissue paper and broken dreams. I took one ornament, a photo frame one from 1995, the last Christmas before everything went wrong. It had a picture of all four of us smiling before Connor became the golden child and I became disappointed. Before the stealing, the lies, the choosing sides. We looked happy. Maybe we were. March 10th, 5 days before trial, Blackstone reappeared. Not as Connor's lawyer, but as a messenger. He had an offer. Connor would confess to everything, serve 10 years, but I had to agree to split the estate with him. Half of everything, clean break, no civil suits afterward. I laughed. Actually laughed in Richard Blackstone's face, this man who'd never lost a case. Connor had nothing to bargain with. He was going to prison for decades, would lose everything in restitution, and would never see a penny of inheritance. Why would I give him anything? Because, Blackstone said, pulling out a folder, he has this. Inside was a letter from Mom, dated a month before she died. In her shaky handwriting, barely legible from the chemo tremors, she'd written that she wanted Connor to have everything. That I was successful enough, didn't need help. That Connor was her baby boy who needed protection. It's notarized, Blackstone said. Legal. Shows your mother's actual wishes. I studied the letter, the notary seal. Recognized the notary's name, Connor's girlfriend's sister. The date was interesting too. Mom had been in the hospital that entire month, heavily sedated, unable to write her own name, much less a letter. This is forged, I said. To prove it, Blackstone challenged. I smiled. The same smile I'd given Connor when he thought he'd won. I don't have to prove it, Richard. You just committed a felony by presenting forged evidence to a federal prosecutor. Congratulations, you just became a co-conspirator in Connor's crimes. Blackstone went pale, grabbed the letter, left without another word. That night, he withdrew from any association with Connor's case and flew to vacation in Bermuda. Even the best lawyers know when to run. March 14th, the day before trial, Connor tried one last manipulation. He posted a suicide note on Facebook, saying he couldn't face the shame of trial, that I'd driven him to this, that his blood was on my hands. Then he swallowed a bottle of aspirin, not enough to die, just enough to get a hospital stay and delay trial. The judge wasn't sympathetic. The trial would proceed with Connor attending from his hospital bed if necessary. No more delays, no more games. That night, I couldn't sleep. Tomorrow, my brother will finally face justice. Everything I'd worked for, planned for, orchestrated, came down to 12 strangers deciding Connor's fate. But I'd done everything possible. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, damning. I stood at my apartment window, looking at Philadelphia's lights, thinking about Mom and Dad, wondering if they'd forgive me for this. wondering if they'd finally see Connor for what he was. Wondering if it mattered anymore what dead people thought of choices they'd forced me to make. The trial began at 9 a.m. sharp in the federal courthouse in Baltimore. Connor, released from the hospital but still playing victim, arrived in a wheelchair he didn't need, wearing a suit that had fit him 30 pounds ago. The stress had aged him 10 years in 12 months. Good. The gallery was packed. Media, curious public, and every person Connor had wronged over the years. His ex-wife Melissa sat in the front row, documenting everything for their children. The girlfriend was notably absent, fled to Miami with whatever jewelry she'd managed to keep. Michael Chin opened with devastating precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, holding up a photo of my parents. Robert and Helen Whitfield worked their entire lives to build something to leave their children. They trusted their son Connor to help them in their final years. Instead, he systematically stole everything while they were too sick to stop him. The prosecution presented evidence for 3 days. Every forged check blown up on a screen. Every fraudulent signature compared to authentic ones. The life insurance policies purchased on dying parents. The credit cards used after death. The will was signed by a man who didn't remember his own children's names. The forensic accountant testified that Connor had stolen $1,247,892 over 7 years. The handwriting expert confirmed 37 instances of forgery. The neurologist explained that my father couldn't have legally signed anything for the last 3 years of his life. The oncologist confirmed my mother's cognitive impairment during chemo. But the most damaging testimony came from Connor's own son, Nathan. Melissa had let him testify about visiting his grandparents with Connor. How Connor would go through their papers while they slept. How he'd heard Connor on the phone, laughing about how easy it was to get money from senile old people. Connor's defense was pathetic. Sarah Martinez tried to argue diminished capacity, that Connor had been stressed from his divorce, his business failures, the pressure of caring for elderly parents. She painted me as the absent daughter who'd abandoned the family, leaving Connor to handle everything alone. Then she made a crucial error. She put Connor on the stand. Connor tried to cry, but no tears came. Claimed he'd only taken money his parents offered. Said the signatures were real, that Dad had good days and bad days. Insisted the will reflected their true wishes, that I was just bitter about being cut out. Michael Chin destroyed him on cross-examination. "Mr. Whitfield, you claim your father was competent to sign this will?" Chin asked, holding the document. "He had good days," Connor repeated. Chin pulled up medical records. "On January 15th, the day this was allegedly signed, your father was in the hospital with advanced dementia, unable to recognize his wife of 50 years. Was that a good day?" Connor stammered, said he must have gotten the date wrong. Chin showed the notarized date, the witness signatures. So the notary got the date wrong too? And the witnesses? Connor's story fell apart. He contradicted himself, got angry, and showed the real man under the Grieving Son Act. When Chin asked about the life insurance policies, Connor actually said they were an investment in his parents' future. The jury looked disgusted. The closing arguments were formalities. The evidence was insurmountable. Connor had committed every crime he was charged with and a few more besides. Sarah Martinez did her best, arguing for mercy, for understanding. But you can't polish a turd, even in federal court. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. 2 hours to review 45 charges, millions in theft, years of elder abuse. They came back with guilt on all counts. Connor collapsed, genuinely this time. Had to be carried from court on a stretcher. Sentencing was scheduled for May 1st. The federal charges alone carried a minimum of 25 years. The state charges would add another 15 to 20. Connor would be in his 80s before possible release, if he lived that long. But I wasn't satisfied with just prison. I wanted everything. I filed a civil suit the day after conviction. Wrongful death, claiming Connor's theft and abuse hastened my parents' deaths. Elder abuse, seeking triple damages under Maryland law. Fraud, demanding return of everything stolen plus interest. Intentional infliction of emotional distress for what he'd put the family through. Connor had no money for lawyers now. Everything was frozen, seized, or spent. He got a different public defender for the civil case, fresh out of law school, overwhelmed by the complexity. I represented myself. 20 years of prosecutorial experience against a rookie defender. It wasn't even fair. Every document, every piece of evidence, presented with surgical precision. I made sure the jury understood not just what Connor had stolen, but what he'd destroyed. The family holidays were ruined by his drunken demands for money. The peace my parents should have had in their final years. The relationship between siblings that he'd poisoned with greed. The civil jury awarded me everything. The house sale proceeds, all recovered stolen funds, triple damages for elder abuse, punitive damages for fraud. Total judgment, $4.7 million. More than Connor had stolen, more than the inheritance, more than he could pay in 3 lifetimes. But the best part came during the sentencing hearing. Judge Patricia Blackwell, known for harsh sentences for financial crimes, asked Connor if he had anything to say before sentencing. Connor stood, shackled, and looked at me. "Rosalind destroyed me," he said. "She couldn't accept that our parents loved me more. This is all revenge for being second best." Judge Blackwell looked at him with contempt. "Mr. Whitfield, your sister didn't destroy you. You destroyed yourself with greed and entitlement. You stole from the people who loved you most, who trusted you completely. You watched them deteriorate while picking their pockets. That's not just criminal, it's monstrous." She sentenced him to 35 years federal, 20 years state, to run consecutively. 55 years total. Connor would die in prison. As they led him away, Connor looked back at me one last time. His eyes weren't angry anymore, just empty. He finally understood what I'd known all along. He'd traded everything for money that was never really his. The courthouse steps were crowded with media when I walked out. They wanted statements, reactions, the story of the prosecutor who'd taken down her own brother. I gave them nothing. This wasn't about fame or vindication in the public eye. It was about justice for 2 old people who died believing their son loved them more than their money. Melissa waited by my car with the kids. Nathan and his sister Emma hugged me, thanking me for the trust funds, for making sure their father faced consequences. They were good kids despite their father. Maybe because of their mother. They'd be okay. That night, I sat in my Philadelphia apartment with the one Christmas ornament I'd kept. The photo from 1995, when we were still a family. Before Connor learned to lie, before I learned to be a prosecutor, before our parents chose sides in a war that nobody won. I thought about calling Aunt Helen, telling her it was over. Thought about visiting my parents' graves, telling them their son was finally paying for his crimes. But what was the point? The dead don't care about justice. Only the living need closure. 6 months after the trial, I stood in the empty house in Bethesda one last time. The new owners had given me permission to retrieve something from the attic, a box of my childhood things Mom had saved that the estate sale had missed. The house felt different. Lighter somehow, like the weight of all those lies had finally lifted. The new family had painted the walls bright colors, hung children's artwork in the kitchen. Life had returned to a place that had been dying for years. In the attic, I found the box. Report cards, art projects, a diary I'd kept at age 10. But underneath was something else, Mom's journal from her final year. I sat on the dusty floor and read. She'd known everything. Every theft, every lie, every forged signature. She'd documented Connor's crimes in detail, writing how it broke her heart, but she couldn't bear to see him in prison. She'd rather die thinking he might change than live knowing he wouldn't. The last entry was dated a week before she died. "Rosalind will never forgive me for protecting Connor. But she's strong enough to hate me. Connor isn't strong enough for me to stop loving him. I'm leaving her nothing because I know she'll survive. I'm leaving Connor everything because I know he won't." I sat there for an hour reading and rereading that passage. My mother had sacrificed my relationship with her to protect Connor from himself. She'd known I'd discover the truth, known I'd seek justice, known I'd survive the betrayal. She'd counted on it. The new owner found me there, crying over a journal written by a woman who'd loved me enough to let me hate her. She offered me tea, this stranger in my childhood home. We sat in the kitchen where I'd learned to cook, and I told her the story. All of it. She listened without judgment, then said something that changed my perspective. Your mother gave you what Connor never got, the chance to become who you really are. He's still trying to be who she needed him to be. I left the journal in the attic. Let the new family find it someday, wonder about the woman who'd written such sad words. It wasn't my story to keep. Connor's prison was 2 hours from Philadelphia. I'd never visited, never planned to, but his kids asked me to drive them one Saturday. Melissa was sick and they wanted to see their father. I agreed for them. The federal facility was exactly what you'd expect. Gray walls, gray floors, gray future. Connor came out in orange, looking older, thinner, broken. He saw his kids and tried to smile, but saw me and the smile died. The kids talked to him through glass phones while I waited outside. 40 minutes of awkward conversation, Connor trying to be the father he'd never been, the kids trying to pretend this was normal. When they finished, Connor gestured for me to come over. I picked up the phone. Why? He asked. Not angry anymore, just confused. Why help my kids when you destroyed me? Because they're innocent, I said. And because Mom would have wanted me to. He laughed, bitter but real. Mom. She knew what I was doing, you know. All of it. Never stopped me. I know, I said. I found her journal. His face changed, something like understanding crossing it. She set us both up, didn't she? Made me the thief, you the prosecutor. We played exactly the roles she expected. Maybe I admitted. Or maybe we chose those roles ourselves. He looked at his kids through the glass, then back at me. Take care of them, Rosie. Better than I did. Better than Mom and Dad did with us. It was the closest to an apology I'd ever get. I nodded, hung up the phone, and collected the kids. We drove back mostly in silence, but Nathan asked one question. Do you hate him? I thought about lying, making it easier. But these kids had been lied to enough. Sometimes I said. But mostly I'm just sad about what we all lost. Connor died in prison 3 years later. Heart attack at 52, the stress and confinement taking their toll. I handled his burial, a simple service attended by his kids, Melissa, and me. We buried him next to our parents, the family reunited in death as they'd never been in life. I still prosecute financial crimes, still send men like Connor to prison. But now I understand something I didn't before. Sometimes the real crime isn't the money stolen, but the trust betrayed. And sometimes the real punishment isn't prison, but knowing you became exactly what everyone expected. There's a photo on my desk now, next to the one of my grandmother. It's from Nathan's college graduation last spring. He's standing between his sister and me, all of us smiling. Real smiles, not the performed ones from family photos of my childhood. He's studying law, wants to be a public defender. Says everyone deserves representation, even people like his father. Emma's in art school, painting portraits that capture the darkness under perfect surfaces. Her thesis show was called Inheritance, Paintings of Objects That Carry Family Trauma. One painting was of Mom's sewing machine, broken and beautiful, abandoned, but somehow still valuable. She gave it to me. It hangs in my apartment, a reminder that broken things can still create art. I never married, never had children of my own. But I became the aunt those kids needed, the stable adult who showed up consistently. We have dinner every Sunday, a new tradition built on the ashes of the old. We don't talk about Connor much, but he's there in the spaces between words, the father they lost twice, once to his crimes, again to consequence. The money from the civil suit went mostly to Nathan and Emma's education, the rest to organizations fighting elder abuse. I kept none of it. Blood money, even legally obtained, leaves stains. My prosecutor's salary is enough. It always was, despite what my parents believed. Sometimes I dream about that reading, about Connor's smirk, about the box of photos that became evidence. In the dreams, I make different choices. Sometimes I just walk away, let Connor have everything, move on with my life. Sometimes I forgive him immediately, offer to share everything, pretend we're a family. But I always wake up knowing I did what I had to do. Not for revenge, though there was satisfaction in his destruction. Not for money, which I didn't keep. But for truth. For the principle that actions have consequences, even when you're the favorite child, even when your parents enable your crimes, even when you think love makes you untouchable. Connor thought our parents' love was a license to steal. He was wrong. Love isn't protection from justice. It's supposed to make you worthy of that protection. He never understood that. Maybe our parents didn't either. I still have that Christmas ornament from 1995, the one with all four of us smiling. But now I see what I couldn't then. Connor's hand reaching for something just out of frame, my father looking away, my mother's smile forced. Even then, we were performing as a family rather than being one. If you're watching this story unfold, maybe recognizing your own family's dynamics, understand this. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. Sometimes it's the strength to stand up to those who would steal from the vulnerable, even when those thieves share your blood. Especially then. Connor stole $1.2 million from our parents. But our parents stole something from both of us: the chance to be siblings instead of competitors, the possibility of love without conditions, the family we might have been if they hadn't chosen favorites. In the end, I got my inheritance after all. Not the money, though that came eventually through the courts. Not the house, though I stood in it one last time. But the knowledge that I could survive betrayal, seek justice, and still have room for compassion. That's what Mom's photos really contained. Evidence not just of Connor's crimes, but of my capacity to endure them. Connor died believing I destroyed him out of jealousy. He never understood that I destroyed him out of necessity. Someone had to stop him. Someone had to say that stealing from the sick and elderly was wrong, even when they loved you, even when they let you. That someone had to be me, the daughter who got nothing but became everything my parents never expected, their son's reckoning. The Bethesda house stands with a new family now, children running through rooms where Connor and I once played before we learned to hate each other. They'll make their own memories, their own mistakes, their own choices about what family means. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they ever feel the ghost of us, the family that chose sides until there was nothing left to choose. My name is Rosalind Whitfield. I'm a federal prosecutor who sent her own brother to prison, where he died. I inherited nothing but gave everything to his children. I lost my family but found my purpose. And if I had to do it again, knowing the cost, knowing the loneliness that comes after justice, I would. Because some things matter more than family. Truth matters. Justice matters. Protecting the vulnerable matters, even when the vulnerable chose their predator over their protector. Connor got 55 years in prison. I got a lifetime of knowing I did the right thing. We both got what we deserved. If this resonates with you, if you've been the child who got nothing while watching the favorite destroy everything, know this: your worth isn't measured in inheritance. Your value isn't determined by parental preference. And sometimes, the greatest gift your family can give you is the strength you develop from surviving their failures. Subscribe if you understand. Share your city if you're comfortable. And remember, blood might be thicker than water, but justice is thicker than blood.